Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something incredibly personal, really challenging. It's sparked by source material shared with us by a listener, Joseph Lavant. He's grappling with some of the heaviest questions out there, suffering, death, the state of the world.
Yeah, and this reflection from Lavant, it takes us on quite a journey. Starts with feeling like completely overwhelmed by global issues.
Right.
But then lands on this surprisingly different perspective about where our focus should really be. And ultimately finding a kind of powerful sense of personal agency.
Exactly. So our mission, our deep dive today is really to unpack that journey. What are the core insights Lavant pulls out from wrestling with these tough questions?
How does he get from that despair to, well, a call for individual action?
Yeah. And, if you've ever felt just swamped by the news, by the sheer scale of suffering out there, well, this deep dive is probably for you. Let's jump into what actually sparked this for him.
Okay. So Lavant starts with this very relatable thing, really, just watching the news.
He describes it as like a relentless stream of political turmoil, misbehavior in the public eye, crime, war, just this overwhelming wave of negativity that frankly leaves you feeling pretty depressed.
And he zeroes in on a specific, really stark example that highlights the scale of suffering he was seeing. He mentions a war in the Middle East.
Right.
Where approximately 150,000 people were killed, mostly civilians. And this was, according to the source material, in retaliation for the World Trade Center attack in New York.
Which killed nearly 3,000 people.
Yeah, that contrast in numbers really struck him, just highlighting the immense human cost involved.
And that stark comparison, it immediately brings up a fundamental question for him. Like, is there really a significant difference between active, intentional killing, war, murder, and what he sees as more passive death?
Things like unchecked starvation or preventable diseases, genocides that just get ignored.
Exactly. He sort of feels this equivalence in the tragedy itself,
Yeah.
Regardless of how it happens. The sheer scale of the suffering is what's overwhelming. And thinking about this, it leads him to a pretty bleak view of humanity, actually.
Yeah. The source describes humans as being, quote, incredibly malignant and destructive. And importantly, Lavant points out this destructive capacity exists both actively and passively.
Right.
He reflects on how easily individuals or even whole groups can be turned into what he calls monsters. Sometimes all it takes is a powerful voice, someone persuasive.
A voice using what he describes as passionate words that appeal to hate and fear, discrimination and exclusion, superiority and inferiority. And Lavant notes the disturbing way Scripture itself is sometimes twisted to justify actions, quoting bits out of context, while totally ignoring the core messages, often about love.
And this really difficult view of human nature, combined with the scale of suffering he's seeing, it naturally brings him to question, the divine.
Yeah, the age-old questions, right?
Yeah.
If God is truly good, why doesn't all this suffering just stop?
Or if God is vengeful, why aren't the guilty punished? Why aren't the innocent protected?
And if God is just, why is it always the innocent who seem to suffer the most? These are, profound existential questions that so many people wrestle with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this is where the source, the reflection, takes a really interesting turn. Lavant takes these huge, heavy questions to his father, looking for answers maybe, or just perspective.
All right, but the father's response is incredibly challenging, really unexpected.
He doesn't give him theological answers, does he?
No, not at all. Instead, he counters with questions that completely flip the focus back onto human actions. He asks Lavant straight up, does God pull triggers and drop bombs?
Wow.
Refuse to provide life-saving medicines? Refuse to feed, or even worse, ignore starving children? Does God discriminate and exclude?
And Lavant has to admit, no, God doesn't do those things directly. But he pushes back a bit, saying, God doesn't seem to protect people from them either.
Right. And then the father hits him with this line that just shocks Lavant, a question that honestly initially sounds incredibly callous. He asks, will any fewer be dead in 1,000 years?
Oof. Yeah, Lavant describes feeling just disbelief, even hurt. Like, how could his father, who taught him compassion, ask something like that?
But the father explains his reasoning, and this is really the crucial pivot point in the whole reflection. He tells Lavant his focus is just fundamentally wrong.
How so?
It shouldn't be on death itself, or even the manner of death, because death, that's inevitable. It's a certainty for everyone. He insists the focus must be on life and the manner of living that life.
So the argument is that Truly valuing life itself, its potential, its quality, that's the necessary foundation to stop these kinds of tragedies from even starting.
Exactly. It's a radical reframing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Stop fixating on the endpoint we can't avoid and start focusing intensely on the quality of the journey for everyone who's living right now.
Okay, that's a big shift.
And the father suggests maybe God isn't stepping in because, well, maybe he's waiting for us to come to our senses. He says, every school of spiritual thought preaches love. That's the only solution. But then he points out how that simple, powerful phrase, love one another, it's become almost hackneyed. It's lost its punch.
Like, we just say it, but don't live it.
Precisely. He believes this never-ending cycle of suffering you lament is self-inflicted. It's on humanity.
And he comes back to that challenging metric again. The true measure of our failure isn't just the number of deaths we see now.
Right. It's how many more people might have been born and lived better lives if we, as humans, operated from a place of genuinely valuing life and love.
Wow. That conversation, it leads Lavant to a pretty significant realization, doesn't it?
Yeah. He sees that while it's absolutely vital and moral to intervene in crises, stop wars, give aid that's dealing with the fallout after the damage is done.
Right, it's reactive.
Exactly. The father's perspective pushes him to see that actually preventing tragedies, or as the source says, precluding tragedies from happening in the first place, that requires something much deeper.
Like what?
A difficult, fundamental shift in societal values. And he notes how much easier it is, relatively speaking, to intervene in a war than it is to prevent the conditions that lead to war starting.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Building on that, the source then introduces this idea of a different kind of conflict. One Lavant thinks is, quote, raging around us all the time.
Yeah, and potentially causing more casualties than any historical war we typically think of.
What kind of war is he talking about?
It's not fought with armies and bombs. It's fought through, daily acts of dehumanization and suffering. The source gives some powerful examples.
Like?
Homelessness, loneliness, acts of violence, hateful speech, the mistreatment of children, racism, discrimination, exclusion, all these things.
Things we see every day.
Exactly. And Lavant points out that this war often gets overlooked precisely because we're immersed in them. We've become kind of desensitized, haven't we?
Yeah, accustomed to things like, lies accepted as truth, racism and discrimination as justifiable behavior, exclusion when it serves our purposes.
Right. And he warns this is a war that can easily be lost because, as he puts it very bluntly, good doesn't always prevail over evil.
Mm-hmm.
The core struggle he identifies is just deeply human, isn't it? It's easier to hate than to love, to take than to give, and sometimes to deliberately or reactively commit acts of violence rather than avoid them. That internal battle, that's the real front line.
So, okay, if preventing tragedies needs this massive shift in values, and the biggest war is actually happening all around us in these everyday acts of suffering, what does the source propose as the long-term way forward?
Well, Lavant concludes that it ultimately lies in the education of children. They have to be taught a good path, respectful of others and life itself. If they're not, he feels this pervasive, quiet war will definitely be lost.
But after this really challenging talk with his father, Lavant describes feeling pretty low, depressed, deflated.
Yeah, he felt like he hadn't really gotten any practical advice, and he doubted his own ability to make any real difference when the problems are just so huge.
Yeah. That feeling of helplessness,
Yeah.
I think that's incredibly relatable when you look at the sheer scale of global suffering. It's easy to feel small.
Totally. So he asks his father directly, that big, overwhelming question we probably all feel sometimes. So what am I supposed to do? Just go out and change the world? Like, it's impossible.
Yeah.
And the father's final answer, it just cuts right through all that despair and gives him that powerful, actionable insight. He says, yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to do.
Really? Just like that?
Yeah, but then he clarifies, one person at a time, starting with yourself. Be an example for others.
Oh, okay. That reframes it completely.
It does. And Lavant writes that he actually felt better after hearing that. The impossible task of changing the entire world, like right now, it suddenly becomes the achievable task of changing his world, starting with him.
He realizes he could do that.
Yeah.
And maybe just by sharing these ideas in this reflection, he's already doing a bit more than he thought.
Yeah, I think so. This deep dive into Lavant's source material, it really offers a compelling way to think about immense suffering, doesn't it?
It really does. It urges this shift away from, despair over death being inevitable and questioning external forces towards an intense focus on the value and, maybe more importantly, the manner of life right here, right now. and recognizing the huge potential and responsibility for human action to actually prevent suffering.
Yeah, it highlights that maybe the most critical conflict isn't the one dominating the news channels about international wars,
Right.
but rather that quiet, pervasive war of dehumanization, indifference, and suffering that's just embedded in our everyday society, the stuff we've gotten way too used to.
And the powerful takeaway isn't some complex global policy fix.
No. It's a profoundly personal call to action, isn't it? That changing the world, fighting that everyday war, it starts with self-reflection, with personal responsibility.
And striving to be a positive example, influencing one person, one interaction at a time.
Exactly, starting with yourself.
It really makes you pause and think. Joseph Lavant, he ends his reflection by turning the question back to the reader, and so now to you, the listener, for taking this deep dive into his perspective. This shift from focusing on death to valuing life, from global crises to personal action, what does this mean for you? How might you navigate the suffering and the challenges in the world around you?